I was standing right here, looking up at the wooden car as it ascended the hill. There were 5 passengers, people I hadn't seen, in some cases, even thought about for years. In this dream, they were all different ages. One was barely out of high school. Another was accompanied by a 5-year-old son. The other day, Dinah saw an open email on my laptop. An invitation to my 10th class reunion featuring those 5 faces. She asked me who they were. When we were 6, Rachel and I were taken to see The Adventures of Milo and Otis. This came at the tail end of the long Indian summer day spent at the beach. During one intense scene, I reached over to steal some of Rachel's popcorn, and she bit my hand. Looking back, we used to jokingly refer to this as our first date. If so, it was also our last. Maybe I was always a little bit in love with Rachel Jacobs, but then who wasn't? She had one of those mysterious yet unmistakable auras drawing everyone towards her. She resented this attention immensely, and I think one of the reasons we got along was because I learned to respect her space. She even let me tag along to her job at a nearby farm, watching and sometimes helping as she cleaned the stable, fed the horses, and rode them around in the field. In 7th grade, she mentioned moving out west to live with her father, a former horse trainer turned ranch hand. I was haunted by bad dreams in which she had vanished into thin air, like the children in an after-school special.
Did you just fall down?
Yes, man.
Yes, man.
There's not much 4th graders won't talk about. If something's on their mind, it gets spoken. It's a testament to Jules' natural sense of authority that when he arrived, no one brought up his leg brace. No one spoke of his 9-month absence. And no one even thought about the daredevil stunt that had gone wrong, which had wounded him and killed his little brother. Jules was not his real name. Sometime around 6th grade, everyone began using his nickname instead of calling him David Isaac. I'm pretty sure it was actually from his favorite movie, Pulp Fiction, which Jules used to quote all the time with a wink or a grin. "I'm trying, Ringo. I'm trying real hard." Jules was the funniest, serious person I have ever known.
Why am I doing it? I still don't know yet.
Ready?
Oh, that's what it was. The beer.
Only twice did I witness Jules' mask drop. Once in CCD, when the teacher brought up Cain and Abel, and then again on 9/11. In the midst of hysterical babbling, I noticed he was sitting frozen in his seat, arms gripping the desk, staring straight ahead, and exhaling slowly like he knew exactly what needed to be done. That made one of us. Did I really know R.J. Oliveri, the way I knew the others? When I remember her, I always think of her teeth. Not as they actually were, but as I imagined them. Sharp, deadly, and her grin almost wolfish. R.J. had authority, based on both charisma and accomplishment. Of course, she was also from the town next door to ours, a wealthy enclave. I went to her house only once, for a small get-together in 8th grade, and it felt I was entering the Great Gatsby's estate. She had gotten me drunk and plopped one of her mom's wigs right on my head. I accidentally wore it home and woke up with it in the morning. As it turned out, my invitation was accidental. RJ had confused me with another Jacob at our school, whose mother also had cancer, like hers. She had wanted to trade notes. Her mother was a debutante turned 60s bomb thrower. Cancer accomplished what the U.S. government couldn't, and legend has it when a 14-year-old RJ heard the news, she smiled sardonically, as if refusing to recognize death's authority. I'm sure those teeth never looked sharper. I have to admit I didn't like Jared Essaw, and with good reason too, at least initially. He used to bully me incessantly when we were kids, and it began when I went to his house one day after school. I was playing his Game Boy and I paused it to open the door for Jared's mom. She complimented me and glared at Jared. He stormed towards me, snatched the Game Boy out of my hands and hurled it at the wall, destroying his own device in the process. That was the essence of Jared. No matter how aggressive he was always primarily hurting himself. He wrote an unexpected biographical sketch in freshman English that I've never forgotten. My favorite memory is when I was excited about something. My big sister used to take me to a carousel downtown whenever Mom and Dad fought. There was a ring you could grab when you passed by, a lot of the silver ones and one brass ring. I always wanted to catch it, but there was only one per ride. By the time he was 16, Jared had found a more rewarding brass ring, and he dropped out of school to pursue it. Eventually he was busted, and he faced a rap which he could only beat by turning in his pals. I naturally assumed I'd seen the last of Jared. Turns out I hadn't. Leah Rodriguez always used to make fun of me. I should have taken the hint, but back then I was pretty dense. It only clicked when I took her best friend to prom and ended up making out with Leah instead. She kept giggling and laughing at me. I thought it was because she was high, but eventually she told me the real reason. I was a terrible kisser. On this occasion, it didn't stop what was already in motion. The things I liked about Leah were the very things that kept our relationship off and on instead of truly serious. Leah passed every test, so I concocted new ones. Finally, my arrogance pissed her off more than my unreliability, and she dumped me days before the senior prom. We had a tense reconciliation the last week of school, allowing me to graduate with something like a free conscience. Already by high school graduation, we'd been heading in different directions. She half-heartedly to a community college, and me off on a full scholarship to tackle the big city. I assumed, condescendingly of course, that Leah would drop out, marry some guy, and have kids early, and not necessarily in that order. And I was right. It was myself I was dead wrong about. Grown-ups forget how fascinated and frightened kids are by disappearance. We suspect the nightmare is actually more real than the sunny day. I spent spring break of freshman year alone in my dormitory, recovering from a fever while all the other students flocked to resorts or foreign cities. I was experiencing vivid and almost hallucinatory dreams on a nightly basis. In one of these, I was wandering junior high corridors. Crossing into the cafeteria, I saw nothing except a single milk carton on the table. I approached the table as if in slow motion and finally made out the image on its capsized cover. Rachel's black and white school portrait. I forgot the dream entirely until a few days later when I saw Rachel's picture on TV. At first I thought I was dreaming again, but I wasn't. Her disappearance was national news, even on the cusp of war. Going home for the memorial service and walking around the downtown area where we all used to hang out, it all seemed so lifeless and dead. From that day on, I always seemed to wake up with the taste of ashes in my mouth. Rachel Jacobs was taken outside a Key West resort and murdered on March 17, 2003. Her body was found 3 weeks later. She was 19.
Alright, state your name.
While there was no exact moment when David Isaac became Jules, the same is not true in reverse. I remember returning from Christmas vacation senior year. During roll call, the teacher read his name aloud and corrected herself. David Isaac? I mean Jules? Jules spoke up quickly. No, David is fine. And so, David he was again, though I always thought of him as Jules. His yearbook quote was St. Paul. When I became a man, I put away childish things. This was one way to do it. A few months after I finally dropped out of school and returned home with my tail between my legs, I ran into Jules at a bar. He was on leave just days after Fallujah, and superficially, he seemed the same. Yet I noticed that when he thought no one was looking, he would return to that frozen, intense look I'd seen in the classroom. No one saw him leave. At one point, his seat was just empty, a few dollar bills and some change on the counter. I remember thinking that St. Paul was wrong. The childish things are what keep us alive, even after they've become dead weight.
Re-enlisting. We might be being overran at the moment,
Captain Nelson,
but it's all right.
Before Captain
His hand is sturdy.
Was he had a screensaver.
How do you focus in this thing?
Most.
It was a few days after his re-enlistment that Jules Tank rounded a corner to discover a trigger man punching numbers on his phone with a panicked expression. The Marine I spoke to openly speculated that Jules couldn't bring himself to fire on a 10-year-old. Jules' death was the first I discovered through Facebook. David Jules Isaac was incinerated by an IED on October 12, 2006. He was 23. When I last saw RJ, I was leaving the hospital and she was heading in. I was there for a birth. She most certainly was not. RJ had moved to Philly right after Princeton, a year before we did. I was a struggling door-to-door salesman. However, she was engaged to a young millionaire and hired fresh out of school to run a city project. She mapped out a career in law, diplomacy, and maybe even politics, anything that utilized her natural talents as a leader. Any resistance in her path she would ruthlessly overcome. Her first diagnosis was met, I understand, with a stubborn, angry refusal to play the game. Against her father's and fiancé's advice, she avoided conventional treatments in favor of natural methods and met her goal of recovering in time to run the New York Marathon a year later. A few weeks after, she was married. This photo was the last she ever allowed to be taken. She did not want to be seen at her weakest. She and her new husband were waiting to share her pregnancy until after her honeymoon. But in fact, she had received other medical news as well, and this time RJ assented to the advice of her loved ones. And so I saw her, 10 months of radiation and chemo later. The nurse rolled her wheelchair past me with a polite nod, and I didn't even have the guts to return the gesture. Her funeral was the last event I attended with my wife. Rebecca Jade Olivieri succumbed to malignant melanoma after a 2-year struggle on August 10, 2008. She was 24. Jared's path crossed mine 3 more times. While waiting tables in Boston, I found him rooting through the trash outside. I brought leftovers from the kitchen, which he received gratefully without recognizing me, to my relief. 2 years later, jobless and divorced in Melrose, still a dry town back then, I was trying to turn my life around. A friend took me to a meeting where, to our mutual surprise, Jared and I ran into one another. Chatting over coffee, after our chance encounter, Jared filled me in. After his mother's death, he dropped into a bottomless pit of drugs and despair, bouncing between rehab, halfway homes, and mental health clinics. Having since then found sobriety and religion, Jared kept circling back to the images of Noah and the flood. At one point, he said something I'll never forget. When I'm sober, I feel like I'm drowning in a stormy sea. Lit, the waves toss me around, but I've still got my head above water. It's hell, but it's just a better feeling. Walking back to the car afterwards, my other friend remained silent and then finally pronounced, I give him another 6 months. On New Year's Eve, I spent 4 hours on the T thanks to a jumper at Downtown Crossing. And I cracked the same dark jokes as everyone else, until I caught the dead man's name. Jared Essaw was crushed beneath the last Red Line train on the morning of January 1st, 2010. He was 25. As I predicted, Leah dropped out of school. She found a job as a night receptionist in an office and proved herself indispensable through a series of promotions. She had a son. Then she got married. She moved around, Boston, then Philly, leaving her promising job for her family's sake, or rather, for her husband's. And soon after a daughter's birth, they were finished. I helped her move out over 4th of July weekend in 2009. She was heading to Florida to be closer to her parents. All smiles, talking about Disney World, and not having to shovel snow anymore, she only embraced me and broke into tears upstairs. There was much said, but one thing sticks with me. I never blamed you. God, that hurt. We had resumed our casual relationship in the fall of 2004 when I was in my post-dropout tailspin. Precisely because it was neither planned for nor planned against, Leah found herself pregnant. Our son was born early in 2006 and we were married later that year, informally in a town hall. I even forgot to kiss the bride. Looking back over those years, I'm most astonished by the many relocations and how each was supposed to give us a fresh start. Disorientingly moving back home, my old room like a museum exhibit, then that shabby apartment with Leah, our first tentative step into adulthood. The apartment in Boston with the angry Jamaicans next door, always getting into arguments. I remember our self-consciousness when we'd argue too, knowing what it was like to hear those fights through paper-thin walls. Finally, that cozy split level in Philly, where we lived when our daughter was born, and for the first time felt like a real family living in our embryo of a home. We even had a patch of front lawn, and I remember Leah's excitement as she put up a tiny Christmas display in December of '07, as if finally now, after all these false starts, we could stake our claim in the rough turf. Instead, it was the last stop. Except that imaginary home in Florida I kept envisioning. The little trailer a few miles from Leah's parents' condo, where the kids would come home sometimes after school. There would be a creek nearby with a motorboat, and we'd hop aboard on overcast afternoons, buzzing into the swamp, me already grizzled in my 30s, always in this vision a cigarette perched between my pursed lips, a fishing pole in one hand and a can of cheap beer in the other. As long as the beer was there, I knew it was a complete fantasy, but on especially barren nights, I'd warm myself by it. Leah Jordan's car flipped on the highway on June 27, 2011. She was killed instantly, and Joseph died 3 days later in the hospital. She was 27. He was 5.5. Only 2-year-old Dinah survived, and it was for her sake, or so I told myself, that I medicated so heavily through the funeral. Despite the flood of memories, that day remains a thankful blur. I brought Dinah back to California, where I had moved the previous year, producing wedding videos and living in a quiet home in the valley. She started preschool this year, and she's already a bright student, full of curiosity. We were running late the other day when she saw those photos and began peppering me with questions. Who were these people? How did they die? What were they like? Did they all know Mommy? I didn't know how to answer her. few months ago on her birthday, I took my daughter to see Brave. Afterwards, we went to the boardwalk and she rode around the carousel and even caught the brass ring on her first attempt. She was so excited. I smiled and let her think that it mattered.